Hi all. This is the developing the content set of Zoom meeting recordings. Um, and this will be the ERA, which is extension, refinement, and application of teaching. And there'll also be some information about teaching by imitation and intra-task variation. We'll also talk about a specific type of feedback called congruent feedback, and then kind of how you round out the lesson in with your closure. So this is the second part to kind of what's expected in a quality lesson. The first one was getting the lesson episode started, and the second part is the content of the lesson, so therefore it's called the development of the content. These lessons will be available on Canvas, and so you can print them off and follow along, pause anytime you need to, and you can see to the left there that there are slides that I've developed specifically for this presentation that have a lot of words. So definitely pause, print it all off, and then that way you don't have to go by line, and you can write those things down. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is extensions. Actually, the first thing we're going to be talking about is what's called an informing task. So they call it the ERA of teaching. I think we do that because it's linked to baseball, but it is, there's actually an I in there. And the I is the informing task. And so it's any kind of task that's introducing something. So if you want to write down the I, it's probably wise. I'll probably add that slide in there when I put it on Canvas. I usually just write it on the board because it's actually not part of the ERA of teaching as well, but it is part when you're doing a lesson plan. So if you're introducing something, that's usually either your introduction, or you've had everybody do an activity and now they're coming back in and you're doing a complete change of activities. That is an informing task. Sometimes it's an extending task, which is why I think we just start there, because it's, if you can tell on the top of this slide, it's a logical progression of tasks. And so really it kind of delineates the difference. Is it the very beginning of a series of tasks, or is it just an extension of the current? And once we get through that, that will probably be a lot more clear. So the E of ERA is extension. This is from Dr. Judy Rink's book, Teaching Physical Education. It was the book that probably you used, or at least was referenced in Case 138. I believe all 4 professors use that text. I know I do. So if you wanted to find the text for that, it would be Judith Rink's Teaching Physical Education. So the E is extensions, and that is a fancy word for tasks or activities. And they're not completely perfectly interchangeable, but if you have a hard time wondering or remembering what extensions are, it's just your tasks. They're just your tasks. So it's a logical progression of tasks. It's throwing back and forth. An extension from that would be stepping back 10 feet so that you throw farther. An extension can be throwing to a moving target. Another extension can be throw in defense. So that's really just your logical progression of tasks in your lesson. That's all they are. You usually base these decisions to change tasks and progress from one to the other based on your knowledge of the content or your knowledge of your learners, your children. So if you know a lot, when to change and what to go to from one to the next really will depend on your knowledge of the activity. And in addition to the knowledge of your students. If your students are super skillful, you can have 2 7th grade classes. One is very, very skillful for whatever reason, all the super skillful kids, and you know that where they're quick learners, they progress more quickly. You know that you're going to build extensions in there that progress more quickly, or that you'll have more frequent changes or more frequent focusing on different things. And then your knowledge of the content as well. So a lot of what you build in your lesson plans, of course, relates to your knowledge of content. Extensions, it's important to understand that extensions can be easier or more difficult. Typically, they are made more difficult. You start in one place and you increase complexity, and they get a little bit more hard as the lesson plan goes. But that doesn't mean that you can't extend backwards. So say that you plan something and it's way too hard for some students, and maybe it's way too hard for the bulk of the students. Then of course you don't just continue on with your lesson plan on paper and keep getting harder, because you're just going to increase the number of times that people fail. You're going to change that lesson plan. Good teachers will change that lesson plan and extend it backwards, extend it to something easier, change the complexity, modify what you are doing to make it more easy for people to be able to learn. And the fourth task there, the fourth bullet there, is why it is extremely important to teach the child, to teach the learner, to teach the individual, and not teach the lesson plan on paper. So I hope that no matter where you go in this world, that you are never required to develop a lesson plan on paper and then follow it, regardless of what your students do. Good teachers, and once you've realized that you're doing this, you can kind of pat yourself on the back. You've crossed over from the student planning a plan to the teacher implementing a plan, where you are focusing on the learner. What is the learner doing? What does the learner need is the most important thing. Your decision to, so once you've got your task progression all planned out, or it's something, if you're a coach and you've kind of done the same thing over and over again, and you kind of know what your plan is going to be, the two things that you use to determine whether you're moving on in a lesson or in practice, but particularly here a lesson, are the students successful? And are they interested? And those things can present a myriad of responses. So if they're super successful, but they're on task, like super successful, 100% of the time they're doing it accurately, but they're still on task, there's some value to that. I mean, they've found it valuable enough to stay on task. So maybe they're loving it. Maybe it's super interesting. And if you say, okay, we're going to move on, they're going to go, "Aw," and you can hear that. Potentially you stay in that activity for a little bit longer. If you're judging something on success rate and 90% of the people are unsuccessful and they're losing interest in it, then it is time to change it up. It's clearly time to make it a little bit more easy, or scrap it all together. So if they're interested and are they on task, or are they successful, those are the two ways that you will forever determine if you're going to change your task, if you're going to extend forward, if you're going to extend backwards. And again, they're used together, because something that they fail miserably at 90% of the time doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea. If they're still interested, if they're still trying over and over again, they're still involved, even if they're unsuccessful. That's where great learning can occur. You might leave that day where they started 90% of the class was unsuccessful, and then by the end, 40% were unsuccessful. That's a huge learning curve. So those two things are used together to determine when is it time to move on. So no matter what, if your lesson plan says you're doing something for 7 minutes and 2 minutes in, they're bored and disinterested, it is time to move on. If your lesson plan says 7 minutes and 10 minutes, they're still engaged, appropriately challenged, and loving it, you stay on. That's real teaching. That's what your students need. They're telling you, they're giving you those clues to move on or to stay. The E in ERA is what's called a refinement. So again, stop and write all this down. But what a refinement is during the lesson, and if you're, again, teaching your learners and not the lesson on paper, you look out, you've given your explanation, you've done an excellent job of introducing and demonstrating, and you've got your whole demonstration, you did a great job of checking for understanding, you asked quality questions, you got quality responses. How many times are we going to do something? 5. Tell me which direction we're going to rotate when we're done, and everybody points that way. And you get out there and there's still something that's amiss. Like there's just something missing, whether it's implementation or of a part of an activity, or they're not. You can see that a good percentage of the people aren't doing a particular cue correctly. This is a perfect time for you to do what's called a refinement. And what a refinement is to stop everyone right where they are, right in the middle of their practice. Freeze, stay where you are, put your equipment down by your feet, because they learn better and listen better when equipment is in their hands. And you say, I see a lot of us doing, we'll go to the throwing thing. Now, when you're throwing this time, and because your target is close, a lot of us have our elbow down and we're not fully following through. Now that you're in your activities, I want you to really focus on whatever it is, elbow up, follow through. You are refining for the quality of the movement. Freeze everybody right where they are, refocus them and refine for the quality, and then say go. And they go out and do the same exact activity. So you're stopping them, focusing on the quality of the movement, and they resume the same task. That's what a refinement is. Students can and should, in fact, when you bring them in for instruction, that just wastes time that you don't necessarily need to do. If they're really spread out, you can say freeze and get where you can hear me. If you're really quiet, freeze, get where you can hear me. And sometimes you're so quiet that they have to come all the way in. It's worth the instruction than just have them do it wrong. So don't just let them do it wrong and say, I'll fix it next time. Refine for it. Freeze, get where you can hear me, whatever it is. Sometimes it's not just a skill cue. It's not a skill cue, it's a interpretation of the activity. So say you have a lot of moving parts to an activity. It's a difficult thing to kind of comprehend. And you look up and you only have 2 of 15 groups doing it correctly. You can say freeze, take a look at these 2 groups. That's called something else. That's called pinpointing, which is the next slide. But either way, you're refining for the quality of whatever that is. And it's a very powerful tool in helping students focus and understand, because sometimes we present them with so much information that they can't take it all in. That's why we say that they can only do 3 cues at once, because it's just so much. We're giving them this activity, we're expecting them to do these things, and oh yeah, remember these 3 things while you're learning. And so sometimes when they're out there, they're just trying to get the gist of the triangle 2 or whatever it is, this big activity. And then they're like, oh yeah, you have to be reminded, I've got to also do the skill correctly. So refinements are super powerful tools. Where I love them the most, and this seems, I love them all the time, but one of the times that I like them a lot as well is if there's a student who's doing it correctly, who is never a demonstrator. I will stop and pinpoint that student, refine it, and make sure that I'm pointing out something that they're doing well and giving their kind of 15 seconds of fame where ordinarily they wouldn't. It's very powerful, especially in middle school, to kind of point some children out or students out who are doing something well, who aren't necessarily those kids that volunteer. So I mentioned this briefly as far as pinpointing. This is when, I think I've combined 2. Nope, same thing. So it's where you, the same exact thing, instead of refining for just a skill, and sometimes you say, everybody freeze where you are. I want you to focus. I see a lot of you are doing X, Y, and Z, but I want you to focus on whatever it is, getting your elbow up. That is pinpointing of that cue. Or refining for that cue, I'm sorry, refining for that cue. Pinpointing is doing the same thing, but utilizing students, plural, students. So you've sent everybody out in the case, let's say that, again, that there's 2 groups who've picked it up the quickest. And everybody else is still kind of trying, they're talking, they're on task, they're trying to figure out the pieces and parts of the activity. They haven't really got it yet. And you say freeze, get where you can see this group over here and this group over here, and watch how they're, and then you kind of troubleshoot and solve the problems that you think everybody is having. Let those groups perform. You're pinpointing those groups, and it's always plural, and then you don't bring everybody back in. You just say freeze, get where you can see these 2 groups. That's what I want you to do. Focus on the skills, fix whatever it is that you're, here's the explanation of one more time of what you're going to be doing, ready, go. So a couple kind of things to unpack there is it's still refining. You're still refining for the quality, whether it's the quality of the activity or the quality of the movement itself. If you can do those both together, that's even better. But in order to pinpoint, it has to be at least 2 different performances. So it can't, you don't want everyone to look at, you're plucking kids out in the middle of the activity. So you don't want everyone to look at one spot only. So if you're in group, if you're dribbling in self-space, then you can pick one student here, one student there, one student over there. If you're passing back and forth, pick 2, at least 2 performances. So these 2 people and these 2 people over here, so that there's 2 spaces to look in case a couple, there's a couple failures or a couple kind of, failed attempts to kind of get whatever it is going. It's always better to have more than one. Not always better, it's required to have more than one for pinpointing. So you can refine yourself, refine if you're going to be the demonstrator, pinpoint if you're going to do kids in the middle, but make sure it's more than one. And you always go back to the same activity. A lot of people will think that they're pinpointing or think that they're refining, and they'll say, everybody get where you can see these people. Okay, now we're going to add another person, or now we're going to come in and I'm going to introduce something else. So it's really kind of a useless strategy in the progression of a lesson plan and kind of development of content. So put it in the middle, put it where it belongs. Don't do it unless it needs it. It's a very powerful tool to get people to really understand what it is that you want them to do. The next one is my favorite. I call it a trick. It's not really a trick, but it kind of is, because it even works on advanced learners. It works on PE people, no matter what age, no matter what skill, no matter what sport, because it brings out our competitive nature, which is perfect. Anytime you can challenge people with something that gets them more engaged, that's a win. So application tasks, or the A in ERA, are when you, and I'm assuming that you've already paused and written this all down, but it's when you, it's a challenge or a task in the ERA progression that we say that it puts the skill into a new setting, and it's in air quotes probably, yeah, and places tasks in a new setting, not air quotes, real quotes. And it's, for example, say that you're throwing back and forth. And for me, that's one of the most boring things you can put me in. I have a very low attention span for things that are boring. And if you put me throwing back and forth for longer than a couple minutes, I'm going to create ways to entertain myself. And that is never good for teaching and for a lesson to go streamline. So you don't want bored kids creating ways to entertain themselves. Someone's going to be Jerry Rice, and someone's going to be Joe Montana, and we're going to do all sorts of paths. We're going to create ways to make ourselves entertained. Sometimes that's on task, but usually it's not. And it's kind of the beginning. If one student gets to do it, one group of students get to do it, then the next, and the next, and then everybody's off task. So application tasks actually prevent that, and they refocus people in the middle of a lesson and potentially in the middle of a really boring activity, and you can make it more exciting. So for example, throw them back and forth, and I see people getting a little squirrely, people are getting off task, they've been here for a while, they're not doing their, they're staying on task to the naked eye, so to speak, but you can tell that they're over it. And you say freeze. Now what I'm gonna give you a minute, and I want you to see how many you can throw to your partner's chest within a minute. Ready, go. So it's this weird, see how many, that is this challenge that people will most of the time go, huh, okay, challenge accepted. I don't know why. See how many is a very powerful tool, and it is in quotes for a reason, because it has to have see how many in it for it to work. So many times, because on paper, it says something like if you put them in a 3-on-3 game, and that's the challenge. And that is fine and well, and you are going to have application tasks that appear in 3-on-3, but just by the nature of putting someone in a 3-on-3 game does not make it an application task. You have to challenge, you have to set up the activity so that they are challenged to do whatever it is that you've asked them. So if I say, see how many you can do in a row, you have something now to focus on and to be engaged in, even though it's the same activity, even though it's not a new activity, or it's just a new setting, because it's this kind of new focus. So see how many you can do in 30 seconds, see how many you can do in a row, keeping score. So say that in volleyball, you're going to pass to your partner. If you pass it straight to them, you get 3 points. If you pass it within one step, or if their arm's extended, you get 2. And you create something. You say, I'm going to give you 10 passes. Keep score. See how many points you can get. They're doing the same thing. You're probably just passing to a partner, and now they're keeping score. So you've tricked them to stay on task longer. It's the greatest tool ever. You should use it in every lesson. I use it in every single activity lesson I create. It's great. And again, that see how many has to be there for it to be an application. There's very seldom times where it is an application task that doesn't include see how many. It has to be a place where students are applying the skill, and just putting them in a 3-on-3 game. If you're to work on a give and go, or anything, a quick one-time pass, and you say, all right, we're going to work on that in the game, ready, go, and there's no focus on that. They're not applying the skill there. You ask them to, but in implementation, it doesn't actually happen. So it has to be an activity that goes with that application. It has to appear there, and the way that it does is see how many. So if you're doing a lesson plan and you've got your E for extensions, and you write EXT by all your extensions, and you throw in a refinement that will say freeze, focus on you, or pinpoint 2 or more groups, but your application will say see how many dot, and then you'll fill in the blank, so to speak. Okay, teaching by invitation. I have an excellent video that just wouldn't convert, and I'm kind of bummed. But the next two slides that are teaching by invitation and intra-task variation are really capitalizing on, or kind of two different ways that you capitalize on what's termed as the slanty rope. And it's a word that spell check doesn't like very well because I don't think it's a word. It's slanty, S-L-A-N-T-Y. And it's this notion of changing a task based on the learner's ability to do whatever the task is. So for example, and I always love this example because it was actually real for me. I'm not a jumper. I'm tall, lucky, so I can play some sports, but I never was able to jump things, jump high. And so in college, we had to jump over this high jump, and I was terrified, thinking that I was going to have to do the Fosbury flop, mostly probably a flop than actually Fosbury. But when I approached up the high bar, it was actually slanted, like literally slanted on the high side and the low side, and it was kind of affixed that way. And so what it was is, if you were the high jumper, which I was not, if you were the high jumper, you could jump over the uprights on the high side. And if you were a beginner or someone who doesn't jump high or someone who's never done it on Fosbury flop, or let alone know what it is, you can start on the low level. And that's a very literal way of understanding what a slanty rope is. But it's this notion of what's called inclusion teaching, or inclusionary style of teaching, where you include all learners. You include the people who are just starting and the people who have played after school forever and ever. And so with that, you are challenged for the rest of your career, right, if you're doing it right. Every day with walking in and saying, okay, I'm going to teach a tennis lesson. I want to appropriately challenge the beginners, and I want to challenge those kids who have been playing tennis after school for a very long time. And that's one of the challenges of physical education, is that if you're doing it right, you will have a very large spectrum, and you will have to make certain changes every single day, and concessions and modifications for the giant learning spectrum. So in teaching by invitation, students will have a choice, and those choices have to be equally acceptable. For example, and for those of you who are hardcore rule following official guidelines, you play basketball, you shoot from, I think it's 15 feet and the basket's 10. I think that's right. Here's a perfect example of what that means. If you've got a child who cannot shoot free throws from the free throw line, it doesn't look like it's supposed to because they don't have the strength for it. They don't have the prerequisite skills. But you consistently require them to shoot from the free throw line, they will develop bad habits because they don't have the strength. So they'll use their entire body in some crazy body compulsion, two-hand, body throw up to get that ball up there. It looks nothing like you want it to. If you were to say that you're allowing for individual differences. So if I'm the person who can't shoot from the free throw line, I can move up a couple feet so that it can look like it's supposed to look. So I don't have to put this elbow out to get more, use both hands to get more force on the ball. I can do it the proper way. Use a smaller ball, a non-regulation ball, perhaps a volleyball that's nice and light. Those are the types of things that is teaching by invitation. So you'll introduce the skill. Today is volleyball. We're going to serve from the service line is back here. It's 30 feet away. And so for some of you, you've never done that. I'd like you to step up to the 10-foot line, and then I'd like you to serve. And the more, if you can do the proper form, and you get the ball over, then you get to step back, and you can step back and back. That's teaching by invitation, where you invite the whole class. Here's the skill, and then you have all of these other kind of ways that you can perform that are equally acceptable for all the individual differences. It is the only way that you can appropriately challenge everyone, and it is super important to appropriately challenge everybody. Another kind of concept of the slanty rope is, let's say that you were working on throwing and catching, or just throwing, and you're all throwing at the gym wall, if you will. And in a very literal sense, if the wall's out in front of me and I have a line on the ground, a masking tape or something on the ground, where on the one side of the gym, the line is only 10 feet from the wall. And then the line is strung all the way across the whole gym, and on the other end of the gym, it's 30 feet away. And you can go anywhere along that slanty rope and aim at the targets. That's a slanty rope theory. That's inclusionary. So if you're just starting, you can go close. If you are on the baseball, softball team, you can go far away. There's also other ways that include I think the next notion of intertask variation. So if you're in the same example where you have this slanty rope across the gym, and if you're beginning, you're close. If you're advanced, you're far away. on the wall, the gym wall itself, there can kind of be this notion of slanty rope as well, where I have giant targets and itty bitty targets and medium targets, and they're all over the wall. So big hula hoops, big targets, wherever it is, all over the wall, little ones as well. So if I'm throwing from 10 feet away, and I'm hitting the big target pretty well, pretty consistently, then I can move to the medium target or the super small target. Or I can move farther down the line and throw for farther away, aiming at the big target. I just gave you like 7 examples on how you, and more importantly, your students can be successful. And those are the types of things that you always want to be thinking about within your task. How are you going to change it so that students can do better, be more successful, be more engaged, and get better? And so another way to do that is that intra-task variation. So, and this one is you changing the task for the learner. So say, for example, that you've got a bunch of kids and they're all dribbling, and you have them dribbling around or doing different pathways and whatnot. And you've got a couple kids on the basketball team who are clearly skillful, clearly been dribbling for a long, long time, and dribbling in a circle and is not, they need more. And you have them and you say, okay, I want you to go crisscross back front, crisscross. So they're in the same exact activity as everybody, whether you say you're in a big, you're pretending that you're doing Indy 500 and you're going around and you go faster on the outside and slow on the inside or whatever, vice versa. And you see kids who need more of a challenge, you can change it for them. That's called intra-task variation, where you actually change the experience for the learner. Sometimes you can put that as the whole class. Sometimes you just pick individual learners. And at any rate, both of the last 2 slides are this inclusion teaching, where the advanced kids need to be more challenged. The beginning kids, they need a challenge that they're going to be successful at. And those two, if you kind of always frame teaching so that you can consistently challenge everyone, it is hard work, but you'll have amazing results. For example, say that you're teaching juggling. That's a really good one to teach PE majors in particular, because some can juggle, and you can give them juggling balls or tennis balls or things that are more difficult. Or you can give scarves. You can juggle 3 items, or you can juggle 2. You can juggle 3 tennis balls or 2 tennis balls. If you're really beginning, notice I didn't say really horrible. If you're really a beginner, then you juggle 2 scarves until you can kind of get down the 3rd scarf. You do 2 scarves, and then you go 2 bean bags, and then you do 2 tennis balls, and then you move to the 3rd item, and then you go back to scarves. So there's lots of variation that you can do, and all of those things should be equally as acceptable. So we're going to try to juggle for 10 seconds. Pick what you're most successful. That's our goal today. We're going to juggle for 10 seconds. Pick the thing that you're most successful juggling with, and then challenge people to kind of move on and make things easier and harder. But typically, these last 2 slides are really important. Think about them every activity that you come up with, because hopefully your activity will address the bulk of the participants in your class. And then you've got to then use your inter-task variation or teaching by imitation to do kind of the outsides of the learning curve, if you will, the super skillful and the beginners, and what is it that you're going to do to make that lesson fun work for them. Physical education is not easy to teach. It is, my saying is that it's the easiest subject to do a poor job. It is really easy to do a horrible job. You can roll out the ball and plan football practices or whip out the newspaper and read it and still get a paycheck. It is the easiest thing to do horribly, and it is one of the hardest things to do well. It is planning for the skillful, planning for the unskillful, planning for the bulk, and all the variations inside is very difficult. And we get the biggest spectrum because there's not real standard. There are standards, but they're not really implemented in a manner that when you get freshmen, you know that they have all of the prerequisite skills. So it is quite the challenge. Checking for understanding, if you are kind of getting all your lectures in today, this one was, it's typically found in the introduction, but can be found throughout the lesson. I do it 6 or 7 times a day, and that was the concept of, a quick test for understanding. Who can show me how many times we're supposed to do something? And then the 3 non-examples are, oh, that's not going to be as easy. Thumbs up if you understand. There's another non-example. So if you ask people to give you a thumbs up if you understand, that typically, not typically, that is 99% Not gonna work. So there are some cases, for example, in virtual learning, I'll say thumbs up if you see the checking for understanding slide. But other than that, you need real questions that check for real understanding. Are there any questions, or do you understand? Do not do that. Do not do that. Okay, congruent feedback. So obviously, again, pause and write all this down. This is going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to assess during virtual learning. It's important that we go over it. It is something that that will help your learners learn. It will help determine if you're a good teacher. And it is there it is, the two most important things. The student learning is paramount to everything. And what congruent feedback is say that all of these things are occurring. You are doing an excellent job in the introduction of showing your skill, of demonstrating what it is that you expect, talking about your objectives today. I want you to do this. These are the cues that I want to see, and this is how many times I want you to do it. And the cues today are step with the opposite foot, follow through to your pocket. Step with the opposite foot, follow through to your pocket. You show it in demonstration, you show the part of it, show the whole thing, and then you get everybody out in activity. And whatever your activity is, you are able to then focus on those cues, because the cue is the piece that you want them to learn. So that's how you measure your learning. Then you walk around in almost a broken record fashion saying, excellent job stepping with the opposite foot. Next time, step with the opposite foot. Oh, I like how so-and-so is stepping with the opposite foot. Make sure you follow through to the target. See how so-and-so is following through the target. Good job following through the target. Ooh, I like how you're following through the target. So many times that, number one, beyond a shadow of a doubt, everyone knows the cues. But number two, everyone is reminded continually to focus on the cues, to focus on learning and focus on the quality. So it is really important that they're specifically stated, and then again, it says down there, that last bullet, the broken record approach, so that at the end of the lesson, when you say, who can tell me a cue, there better not be a person alive in your class who doesn't know the cues, almost to where they're like, ugh. And again, remember that when you ask for cues, they need to be important, really comprehensive, checking for understanding questions. So who can tell me a cue? Why is that important? What happens if we don't do that? What happens if, excuse me, in a lesson, we don't have time to step with the opposite foot? What happens, and is that okay? So you're going to specifically state those things over and over and over again, that relate to what you have specifically said you were going to focus on. So let's say that you are going to focus on stepping with the opposite foot and following through the target. And then you say something like, hey, make sure you keep your elbow up. Make sure you keep your elbow up. Make sure you get in a ready position. Make sure you follow through to the target. And you start to change things up, and you say, make sure that you turn your shoulders. Oh, don't forget to transfer that weight. And you do we call it a shotgun approach, where you give so much that nobody really knows what to focus on, and therefore learning actually doesn't occur. If you say, I'm going to focus on these two things, or you don't say that you're going to focus on, which is the more frequent, you just say, this is how you do it, ready, go, learning will not occur. So the perfect way to kind of bookend that is, in your introduction, show it, these are the things we're going to focus on. During lesson, give congruent feedback, which is feedback about the cues that you said you were going to focus on, not just cues of the skill. You said you were going to focus on those cues, and then you say, good job with that cue. Good job with that cue. Excellent job on stepping with the opposite foot. Good job stepping. Remember, we're stepping with the opposite foot. Good job stepping with the opposite foot. I can't broken record it enough. Then at the end, who can tell me a cue? Why is it important to step with the opposite foot? That is what is congruent feedback. That results in the most focused, quick learning. Super important. Incongruent feedback isn't horrible. So if you were to do step with the opposite foot, follow through, and you had someone who was dropping their elbow and you said raise it, it's not horrible. You just want to refrain from doing incongruent feedback throughout your lesson as much as possible. And lastly, the closure. Closure is going to be a little bit different, I've learned in my classes, in that you are definitely going to check for understanding. I've mentioned several times that you can't say, who can tell me Q1, who can tell me Q2, and who can tell me Q3, and those count for 3 questions. They do not. You count for 1, you can ask what were the cues, but then you have to come up with some really good questions that, check for understanding, that talk about understanding, that talk about perhaps where the skill fits in the world, or maybe if it's a strategy, how it fits in. If you're playing tennis, it fits in badminton. If you're doing an evasion game, so you're doing, remember in basketball when we did this? Well, in ultimate frisbee, which we're going to do next, it'll help you here too. It's the same kind of strategies, and those strategies work in lots of different sports. So it's a conversation about understanding and application that you're going to have in the closure. So you'll have 5 questions in all of the classes, and they are going to be checking for understanding and some application-based things. So it is important that you develop your line of questions with kind of students in mind, with a understanding and the fact that you're going to measure if you're doing your cognitive objective in your closure. So you can have students work together and talk, and then talk about different answers, and then always ask the number one question, why? Ask a question, say, why is that important? Ask another question, why, how does that impact the game? Why does that impact the game? So that's the most important thing, is always ask why. And if you're short of a question, you have 3 or 4 questions and you can't think of a 5th one, just throw in a why somewhere, and it'll probably be the best question that you ask. So in the beginning of the lesson, if you said, today my objective for you was to throw, and I want you to hit the target 7 out of 10 times. This is a good time to check in with your students. Show me on your hands how many you did. What was the type of, why were you successful? Why were you unsuccessful? Have conversations that have meaning with people. And if I have a feeling that if we did that more in peer teaching lessons, we wouldn't be so bored in our peer teaching lessons. And so hopefully we get back on campus so that you can actually see if you are bored in peer teaching lessons, because they get a little monotonous. But typically, if we turn these closures into conversations that we have about learning, that's a much different closure. So yay, end of the developing of content lesson. Good job, everybody. Good luck on your quizzes.